Braking is an enormous subject. There's lots of components involved in it, and lots of information that you need to take on board before, during and after what's happening. There's no, or I believe there's no absolute 100% fixed rules. It's more about figuring out what's best for each individual situation. There are obviously hundreds, thousands of scenarios you can generate, but there are a few basic rules I would suggest that you sort of have a think about, and certainly work for me. One of them is starting to build up reference points. Whatever you're going to do on a bike, it's important to be able to replicate it and be consistent. Consistency is one of the lead things I would try and work on with anybody. If you're inconsistent, the problem is with that, if you're trying to adjust something in your riding and you're already inconsistent, it's virtually impossible. It's like knitting fog, it just doesn't seem to work together. So developing consistency is really important, and that consistency starts for me with being able to repeat something. So having reference points, whether they're marks on the track or the reference points you can use, Armco barriers, skid marks, anything like that, preferably things which don't move. Don't use like straw bales and things like that, which can be moved out of the way, or shadows which will change as the day goes on or the sun goes in or whatever. Braking has components, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle really. The pieces or the components need to be put in the right order. If the pieces aren't quite correct and you're assembling a jigsaw puzzle, you'll get two pieces which sort of go together, but you kind of fudge them together and they sort of work, but the picture's never going to be complete. It's never going to be ultimately what you want. When you get the picture right and the components do drop in together, the picture's perfect and the whole job's a lot easier. Braking isn't about just stopping on the approach to a corner. Braking is about reducing the speed so you can control your entry to the corner. So we've broached a couple of topics there, braking and corner entry. The latter part of braking to me is corner entry, so there's like a handover between the hard braking and braking in towards the corner. A lot of people call it trail braking. Now we'll talk about it in a little more detail later on. The actual components of braking involves the mechanics on the bike of weight transfer. When the bike's accelerating down the straight towards a corner, the majority of the weight, even on smaller bikes, is largely on the back wheel. The front wheel's quite light. So consequently, when you shut the throttle and pull the brake on, there's quite a large transfer of weight. Now if you tend to grab or snatch the brake, that transfer of weight is very dramatic. And the problem with that is if it's very dramatic, there's a couple of things can go wrong. First of all, if the conditions aren't perfect, the grip that you've got, if you start grabbing the brake, you can overcome the amount of grip you've got and you can lock the wheel with the obvious crash type scenario. But even in the dry, you can make the bike quite unstable by grabbing the brake and the bike starts to flick about and fishtail. So the transfer of weight needs to be smooth, so it's a case of like roll and squeeze as opposed to shut off and grab. So being smooth, quickly but smooth, is quite important. What's also important to me is finding a point on the track that you can regularly do this. This is where your reference point will come in. Consistency will get you there, so you're driving full throttle towards a braking situation. Now if the bike's upright in a straight line, you can go, generally speaking, from full throttle to full brakes quite quickly. Obviously if the bike's leant over when you decide to go for the brakes, it's still a case of like throttle to brakes, you drive to a brake. But as the bike gets further and further over and you're coming onto the brake, the potential is less, or the grip is slightly less, so the case of like you can't grab a handful like you can do when the bike's upright. So you need to sort of adapt where the bike is and what you're trying to do with the bike at that point. The first part of braking is about keeping the bike stable. So we've talked about it, roll the throttle and squeeze the brake as opposed to shut the throttle and snatch the brake. You don't want to be doing that. The mid part of the braking is where the big power braking comes in, where you're getting rid of all the speed, or the majority of the big part of your speed has to be killed in that mid section of braking. And the latter part of braking is where you're starting to ease the brake back. Even if the bike's upright and you're just about to start tipping into the corner, it's about making sure the bike's stable, transferring a little bit more weight back and letting the bike start to run in towards the corner. A lot of people, when they talk about late braking, it's a case of like almost panic braking, and they can end up a lot of times over braking or just thinking about getting the bike stopped as opposed to entering the corner. So they do a fantastic job of the first part of it, do a super duper late brake, but their eyes are on stalks and all they're thinking about doing is getting the thing stopped. Not a good thing. Big part of braking is knowing when to stop braking. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think about, is you can still brake with the bike leant over. Obviously, as the bike starts to go over, you need to be careful of the front wheel. In certain situations, you may want to start to wander away from you, or a worst case scenario, you lose traction and the front wheel fold up. But in most situations, particularly in the dry, you can brake with the bike at a quite steep angle of lean, but obviously you've got to start easing back on the brake. When the bike's upright, you can brake what I call 100% braking. This is where people's perception come into it. They sit on the bike in the paddock and they're squeezing the lever really hard and they're thinking, God, that's a great lever, I can squeeze it really hard. The chances are when you're out on track, when you're braking as hard as you in brackets can, you're actually only braking as hard as you want to. So it's about that, what I call 100% braking is as hard as you want to brake. If, for instance, you do brake or tend to grab or snatch the brake and the bike does start to become unstable and start to fishtail around, realistically the only way you can regain that stability is to ease back on the brake, to transfer a bit of weight onto the back wheel to get the bike straight, to pull the bike straight, and that gives you your stability again. But if you've left that super duper late, it's all a bit panicky. So it's quite important, the first part, to make it smooth so you can then build that brake from a nice smooth brake to a really firm brake and get some serious speed off. Approaching your reference point is to drive and then brake, as opposed to a lot of people, what they do as they get into an area where, say for instance, they hadn't built up a reference point, they're approaching an area somewhere around here and a brake, they're riding on the guts, like a gut sensation of where their braking is. And as they're approaching that point, they tend to back out the throttle, so they've kind of started to ease off, not acceleration, but ease off the speed. And then often they'll close the throttle for a period of time and then come on the brake, instead of driving to a reference point where they can drive to a brake, creating more of a black and white decision. Now, I call it a black and white decision because if you drive to a brake and you put the brake on as hard as you feel you can, and then you brake, say, you braked a little early, at least you know that reference point works, and then you can edge it towards the corner. If you've kind of rolled back off the throttle and you've waited for a pause for a small time and then come on the brake, you've created what I call a grey area. Now, if you brake at the beginning of that grey area, it's going to be way too early. But if you brake towards the end of that grey area, it might be starting to get a bit late. So you start to react then by making the grey area even bigger. You end up in the situation where you're kind of bumbling towards a corner as opposed to driving to a brake. So it's really important, and it's one of the things I try and leave people is small snippets of terminology. Drive to a brake. That's the reference point. When it comes to setup of the machine, the position of the handlebars and the position of the levers can actually help and improve your braking no end. I do see a lot of riders, they'll position the levers certainly not where I would have them, and it causes quite a lot of stress through the wrists. Road bikes, for instance, tend to have the levers quite high or in a flat position. So when you're braking hard and you've got your arms relatively straight and you're kind of much more upright on the bike, your hand is going through a tilted position like that, so you're kind of squeezing the brake like that. But if you move the levers down so that when your arm is straight and your hand is then, you can push the lever down so you're pulling in that sort of action, it's much easier than trying to do that. You wouldn't, for instance, pick a heavy bucket up, but like that, you'd pick the bucket up straight armed. Now, whether you brake 2 fingers, 1 finger, 4 fingers, it doesn't really make that much difference. It's how you feel comfortable, and providing you can put enough power through the brake. Most modern superbikes, 2 fingers is really all as you need. On a lot of modern superbikes come now fitted with ABS. Now there's a controversy at the moment about whether you take the ABS off, you turn it off, you take it off, or you leave it on. A lot of the bikes, it varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. You can actually tailor the ABS to suit. You can in fact electronically turn it off, or you can adapt it to suit yourself. The BMW S1000 I ride, as you change the mode of the bike, it automatically changes and backs things off. I tried it when I first got the bike in kind of a more of a standard road setting, and on the road it's brilliant, of course, but on the track you very quickly get to the point where the ABS is kicking in and that the lever starts to get sort of, to you, strange, or the sensation you get. It's not, it's actually just that's the way it's set up to work in that scenario, but you've taken it out of that scenario and put it onto the track. And as you go through the different settings, the sport setting, and then you go into slick, etc., that lever feel starts to change. I think it varies from manufacturer to manufacturer is how the brake feels, and that's what you're arguing with here, is how the brake feels. So if you are going onto the track with your bike, don't instantly think, oh, I've got to take it off. Actually work with the settings on the bike, and see if you can come up with a setting which works for you. The BMW S1000 I run, for instance, has ABS fitted, and I just leave it into the slick mode. And with the original standard settings, you tend to get a little more travel in the lever than you would with no ABS, or when you ride it slowly, and it feels initially like you're starting to lose the lever. You're not. What it gives me a nice feeling of depth of the lever, and you can actually feel, as opposed to feeling something which is rock hard. It's a very personal thing, but I like what's called a soft lever, and I like a lever with depth and feel, as opposed to just something which is like you're grabbing a piece of wood. My riding style is kind of old school, if you will, because I ride all sorts of classics and all sorts of odd bikes. Some bikes with very poor braking, you tend to need to be able to have a lot of power through it. So I develop a style of using often 4 fingers. But the problem with 4 fingers is you've got to get your little pinky onto the lever as well. So it means you have to have the lever reasonably close to the bar. It's very much a personal thing. For a lot of people who run just 2 fingers, for argument's sake, the other 2 fingers remain round the twist grip. So if they have the lever with too much travel, it can often trap the other fingers and obviously cause issues with the braking. So finding that lever position is really important. Trail braking is a topic which comes up, and people ask me a lot how it works, why it works, what exactly it is. You know, a lot of people get confused by the whole thing. Trail braking to me is just the last part of the braking, the part of the braking where you've done the majority of your heavy braking, and you're arriving at the point in the track when you're starting to turn into the corner. So the bike, generally speaking, we have to generalise about these things. The bike's coming out the vertical, and you're on your racing line going around the corner. So you get into the point where you get into the actual starting to the tipping point. Now at that tipping point, that doesn't mean that you have to stop braking by that point. You can still do a lot of braking, potentially all the way to the apex of the corner. The apex of the corner is, generally speaking, the slowest part of your arc round the bend. Again, it's generally from that point as you start your acceleration out the corner, or you certainly have stopped your slowing down. All the slowing down is done by that point. So you can imagine the situation now. You've been braking really hard for a length of period of time. You get into the point where the bike's just coming out of the vertical and you're starting to run in towards the apex. You really need to start easing back on the brake. You can imagine the situation with the bike at a big angle of lean. You've got a big handful of brakes. The bike is going to try and fold up on you. You're going to overcome the amount of grip that you've got and the wheel's going to start to tuck, and it all ends up in a horrible mess on the floor if you're not careful. So the easing back on the brake is really important. It also allows a little bit of weight to come onto the back wheel, and you need a little bit of weight in the back wheel to allow the bike to steer itself around the corner. From the position in the track where you've decided, still braking, you've decided to start turning into the corner. If you can imagine the halfway point between popping out of the vertical and arriving at the apex, which is your maximum angle of lean, roughly that halfway point in the track, I would suggest that's a pretty good point to have finished your braking by that point. You can still potentially, with that very light fingers, very light brake, trail it in all the way to the apex, but you're pushing your luck somewhat. And it's amazing how much, even with no brakes at all and the throttle closed, how much engine braking and how efficient that slowing down action is. Engine braking is a really important part of slowing down, and it's something that gets overlooked quite a lot, really. I mean, nearly all modern bikes now come with slipper clutches, which is kind of helping the job, because if you've changed down too many gears on an old style bike without a slipper clutch, the engine braking overcomes the amount of grip it's got, and it starts to make the bike judder, and you've got another issue with stability. Plus you can damage the motor by over revving it, but generally speaking, with the slipper clutch you can feed it a load of gears and arrive at the gear that you want to at the apex, and jobs are good. You do see, watching MotoGP, a lot of the bikes come into the corners with the bikes kind of broad sliding into the corners. Particularly in Moto2 seems to be less like a phase. It's almost the style of braking. I can sort of see the point of what's happening. In a lot of situations, that's naturally what happens. Particularly if the bike's slightly out of the vertical. If the bike's leaning slightly to the right and you brake hard, the back wheel becomes light, and the back wheel tend to pivot round and want to go sideways. If you're leaning slightly to the left, the back of the bike will go slightly to the right. And a bit like a rally car, for instance, you have to kind of steer into it to keep the bike straight. But you'll often see the Moto2 guys, they'll be broad sliding into the corners. My preferred mode of braking is to try and keep the bike as stable and as upright as possible while this is happening. If, for instance, you've got the bike going into the corner, broad sliding going into the corner, it looks very spectacular, but you're holding that slide effectively by keeping the front brake on. And so the important thing there is the timing of the releasing of the brake. So it's another component that you have to put into the braking. If you release the brake too early, before the actual turning point, the bike will straighten up at the wrong time. If you've outbraked yourself and you're still trying to scrub off speed, the bike's still going sideways when you're wanting it to turn. So this broad sliding style can almost be counterproductive if it's not done correct. So I would suggest try and keep the bike as stable and as upright as you can in your braking. Building your confidence up about how hard and late you can brake into a corner is really important. It's obvious, really, is to get a good lap together. It's one of the components that needs to work. But you need to marry your braking up into a corner, marry that up with your corner speed. If you haven't got your corner speed right, or you're still worried about your corner speed, you're going to generally slow down too much at your tipping point before going around the corner. You kind of over brake. Now, the problem with this is it starts to another problem, or generates another problem. What I often see when I'm following people is they brake hard and relatively late, but they brake just for too long and get rid of just too much speed. So as they arrive at the tipping point, they've got down to a speed that they actually want to go around the corner at, but they've still got to get to the corner, got to get to the apex. And because there's like a lull in time between the tipping point and you arriving at your apex, what they then do is actually pick up the throttle. So they're actually almost driving towards the apex. Now, part of the problem with that is if you can exaggerate it to the point where you're accelerating to get to the corner, the bike takes on a completely different aspect. If, for instance, you're going into a corner with the brake on, the bike's being pushed into the floor, the front suspension gets loaded up, the back suspension unloads, The attitude of the bike is very much it wants to go around the corner. If you're off the brakes and pick the throttle up just to get the bike in towards the apex, that attitude of the bike changes completely. You start to put a bit of weight on the back end because you've put a bit of throttle there, a bit of power onto the back wheel, the rear suspension compresses, the front suspension starts to extend, and effectively if the bike had a brain it would assume that you've gone round the corner and you're wanting to go in a straight line. If for instance on a long bend, let's say Corum's for argument's sake at Snetterton or Gerrard's at Mallory, some really long bend where you're going round the corner for a length of time, you've obviously got to have the throttle on, but if you accelerate too early, the bike will want to run out towards the edge of the track and it loses its steering almost completely. Another part of braking which needs to be talked about is wet weather braking. Now this is where you have to draw a line in the sand as to what you want to do, what you want to achieve when you're out there. Obviously if you're doing a racing scenario it's about going as fast as possible. If it's on a track day it's about enjoying it as much as possible. And there's obviously a handover between enjoyment and going as fast as you can. Obviously wet weather braking is a little more hazardous, shall we say, than braking in the dry. On the assumption that you have wet weather tyres fitted to the bike and the tyres are up to a working temperature, the application of the brake is probably the biggest single difference to the bike. When there is weight on the wheel, and particularly if the bike's upright in a straight line, it's quite shattering how hard you can brake in the wet. I often do when I'm braking in the rain, I'll have the back wheel hovering off the floor, which is very similar to you do in the dry. So the amount of power and braking you've got is quite similar. That's when the bike's in the upright position. But you've got to get it to that point. If for instance you're going down the straight in heavy rain or when the track's particularly wet and you go from full throttle and you very quickly grab a handful of brake, you're not giving the bike enough time to get some weight onto the front wheel and to load the front end up. If in that situation you quickly shut the throttle and grab the brake, the tyre hasn't got enough time to grip, and often you'll get the quick slide or the quick twitch, which is clearly very unnerving. So in the wet weather situation it's quite important to slow down slightly the transition between full throttle to full brakes, much more of a steady roll and squeeze. Once you've got the brake on, you can then go to a more powerful, more powerful brake. The releasing of the brake is as important in the rain as well, so that you're transferring that weight smoothly and steadily and slowly. You can't be as vicious and as hard dynamically as you can in the dry.
I quite enjoy riding in the rain. I've built up confidence in what I'm capable of, the bike, and what the tyres are capable of. There's a few important things you need to note, of course. Firstly, make sure you've got the right tyre for the right condition. There's nothing worse than going out on a slick when it's raining. Conversely, if you've got a wet and it's bone dry, that's not going to work either. Make sure your tyres are not only in good condition, they're at the right pressure, and they've come up to working temperature. Wets don't get particularly hot, but they do get warm. So if you feel like you're going to go straight out and get straight up to pace, put the tyres in warmers just for a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes at the maximum. Don't get them too hot, and that'll get you straight to where you need to be right from the off.
So when it comes to braking, the timing of everything is really important. The timing of obviously when you put the brake on, how hard you build the brake up, the timing of starting to release the brake, and the timing of letting the brake off is really important. And then marrying the components together, marrying the end of your braking or the trail braking, if you want to call it that, your braking finishes, and the handover towards that closed throttle and allowing the bike to run into the corner. All of these pieces need to sort of fit together like nice, clean pieces of jigsaw puzzle. I'm always amazed by how good lots of riders are. They whinge and moan about saying they can't do this, they can't do that. there's a lot of really good riders out there, but what a lot of riders struggle with is putting things together. They can be good at all the individual components, but when it comes to the actual knitting them together in, say, a right hand corner, braking, throttle, tipping, etc., putting them all together, sometimes they struggle. Because people take on information in different ways, it's very difficult to talk about something, in this case braking, in one format. So we talked about it earlier, using just audio, which is basically listening to me drone on. We're going to use visual aids now to try and help. So I've drawn this simple diagram. This simple 90-degree right-hand corner highlights a few things really. Almost everybody can go from 100% brakes and do a really good job of the braking. Almost everybody, when they get to the apex, can drive out the corner. The tricky bit is this bit here, the carrying speed into the corner. So let's go through this diagram in a little bit more detail. Essentially it's the same as the way I talked through it before, but this is actually giving you more of a visual reference of what we're talking about. So approaching a corner something like this, you're coming up to down the straight on full gas, and at this point here it goes full gas to full brakes. Now full brakes is, as we discussed before, is 100% braking. Now in the first part of the braking you want to keep it stable, so that's the roll and squeeze. So you build the pressure up to hard braking in this sector. We then come to the T, which is the start of your tipping point, because you're wanting to follow the natural arc around the corner. So at T, we're still at 100% brakes and we can start to tip into the corner. But from the tipping point to what I call the release point, which is roughly halfway towards the apex, we're tapering the brake off. This tapering the brake off is effectively what most people would interpret as trail braking. You're trailing the brake in towards the corner. Now this is without question the hardest bit of the whole job really. If at this point in the track, your tipping point, you've not carried enough speed, the trailing of the brake is almost useless, because you've got to have enough speed to get you to the apex and keep the throttle closed to allow the bike to turn. A bike will always turn into the corner better on a closed throttle. If you're still at your release point, still very heavy on the brake, and you're trying to get the bike down into the corner, you're actually fighting what the bike's trying to do. The bike's naturally wanting to sit up. You can actually try this yourself by running round a long corner with the brake on, throttle closed, and then release the brake. And as you release the brake, the bike will fall into the corner. So you really need by R to have released the brake and keep the throttle closed to allow the bike to turn. But if there's not enough speed here, you arrive at the apex at doing 0 mile an hour. I've broken this particular corner up to start off with basically into two sections. You have the red section, which is from the point you put the brake onto the apex, is all about slowing down, reducing your speed. And from the apex onwards, it's all about accelerating. So it's quite a simple two-part. But there's obviously an awful lot more to it. To simplify it a little bit, you've got really three basic components. You've got your braking aspect, which is from the point you put the brake on to your release point. And then there's nearly always going to be some part of every corner where there's not a lot going on. You're not braking, you're not accelerating, you're just allowing the bike to turn. So there's like a dead section of the corner. Now we want to, in the nicest way, to try to keep that as compact as possible. But then generally speaking, from the apex, it's all about developing the throttle out the corner. Now this bit we're not actually going to talk about too much about in this particular section, because we're all talking at the moment about braking. As I said before, most people can get this section correct. They can use a braking marker point, they can brake late and brake hard. This bit's the tricky bit, because what you don't want at this point is eyes on stalks. You don't want to be too frightened by this point. So this whole exercise is about building up to this point. It's the carrying the speed towards the apex which most people struggle with. Often at the tip-in, it's the point where a lot of people want to get the speed down to the speed that they're going to go around the corner. That means trail braking almost doesn't exist, And it also means they can't keep the throttle closed. They have to get back on the throttle just to get to the corner. And as we discussed before, this causes all sorts of problems with the bike wanting to sit up and drive out, and you end up bouncing off the curbs coming out the corner. So they're keeping the throttle closed and carrying the momentum into the corner, using the bike's momentum to go around the corner. Now, on the assumption that you've built up to this and you've got some sort of a rhythm going, at your tipping point and particularly by your release point, even at your release point, theoretically you should be still going a little bit too fast and allow the engine braking and the closed throttle to get you to this point. Now, in this area here, because you're building up to it, your heart's racing a little bit and you've got a little bit of big eye, but I would suggest if you've not gone massively over what you've normally done, always get off the brakes, keep the throttle closed and give the corner a go. It's fair to say you may run a little wide coming out the corner, but you've got to try and get yourself encouraged to go into the corner confidently. And the only way you can do it is by building up to it. Now this to me is like a basic theory, a basic how-to. The problem with theories is you have to at some point put them into reality. Now in reality, in the real world, there's a million different sorts of corners that you have to deal with. The shape of the corner, the width of the track, bumps, lumps, inclines, hills, etc. So you have to tailor this sort of technique into what in the real world situation. Now, one of the things which affects the closed throttle and all of this particular part of the corner is inclines. Is probably, I would say, the biggest difference. Now, two corners which I can use as references here, which hopefully highlight what we're talking about, is say at Brands Hatch, for instance, is going into Paddock Hill. Now at Paddock Hill, it's a very track specific corner and is a really tricky corner to get right. Now if this was Paddock Hill, for instance, at your release point you're already going downhill towards the apex. Anyone who's been around Paddock Hill will know what I'm talking about. So the closed throttle there is something you're naturally going to actually do because the bike's running away with you at that point anyway. Another corner to think about this is Hawthorns out on the GP section, which is down the back straight, down the hill, and then the run up and then round Hawthorns. Now, at Hawthorns, because of the incline is killing the bike's speed anyway. At the release point, going into Hawthorns, the bike's going uphill at this point, and the hill is naturally killing the bike's speed. So picking the throttle up, or not waiting till the apex, picking the throttle up slightly before, almost straight away after the release, to keep the bike's momentum going around the corner because of the incline, that's quite important. So this section here, the closed throttle, or if you were looking at a 1, 2, 3 section 2 at Hawthorns is almost non-existent. You go straight from a sort of release the brake straight onto the throttle because the hill's killing the speed. Now in the braking area, the type of machine you're on can make a bit of a difference too. Most people, to be honest, on track days are running sort of super sport, super bikes, that sort of thing, 4-cylinder, 2-cylinder, 4-strokes. But that's not all that's out there on track. 2-strokes have their own different problem. It's not really a problem in one sense, but they don't have engine braking as such. So the use of the back brake is a lot more important in this area. Slipper clutches we've mentioned in the earlier videos about, they are fitted to most machines nowadays, and basically once you've rolled the throttle off you can feed it a load of gears, to the gear that you need for the corner, and it deals with it. If you're riding an older machine or something without a slipper clutch, to keep the bike stable in this section, because if you shut the throttle and go down a couple of gears and the back wheel starts to patter and judder, you need to control that. So the option is you either extend the braking and not brake quite as hard, but if you want to get on the case and start braking hard and you start to encounter that sort of juddering sensation with the back end, a good idea is to actually keep a couple of fingers maybe, lightly, ever so lightly on the clutch itself, and pull the clutch in a tiny bit, put the weight of your fingers almost on the clutch, as if you're sort of trying to find the biting point. And that essentially will actually do the job of what a slipper clutch does. Obviously don't pull the clutch in because you're freewheeling at that point, and that is bad news. It's like jumping into neutral, and anyone who has found a neutral going into the corner knows it's pretty bad news. Another way of helping to control this patterning or juddering that you sometimes get on the bike is to match the engine revs to the gear that you're going down into. What I mean by that is, as you obviously shut the throttle, you're going to be revving at a certain RPM. You change down the gear at the same speed, the revs go up. So as you're sort of slowing down, you blip the throttle, a quick blip of the throttle, as you change down the gear, so that when you release the clutch again, the engine revs kind of match. If you, for instance, just shut the throttle and change down the gear and use the clutch and change down to the gears, that's increasing the chances of this engine hopping. What more modern bikes tend to have on them, and you've probably heard the thing, where it's called a blipper, which is an electronic system where you literally close the throttle and downshift. And like the quick shifter changing up, what it actually does is it electronically senses what you're trying to do and blips the engine just the right amount to match the engine RPM and the road speed. So use the engine braking, but you do need to control it. So summing up this particular section of the video, when it comes to the visual aid which we're using here, is I try to get people to identify how they're riding, identify the timing of how and when they do things. Simple things that you need to identify when you're building up these references is the actual reference points themselves. Your first and most obvious one, for instance, is your apex of the corner, so you can get the basic arc or the basic line sorted out. Then you need to start to figure out where you need to start braking, and then being able to control the amount of braking that you need to put into the corner, and then control your entry speed, which your entry speed effectively dictates your corner speed. So breaking the corner down again is you've got a section which I call section 1, which is essentially just your braking. Section 2 is that sort of closed throttle dead section of the corner where you're allowing the bike to turn. And section 3 is generally from the apex onwards, and that's all about drive. Now we're going to have a whole video about drive, and we're going to talk about cornering as well. So it's identifying these points which is absolute key.